Did you know that as you're listening to this, there are over 45 million people trapped in some form of slavery globally? 1 in 4 are children, and every hour an estimated 130 people are trafficked. Slavery still exists today. When I discovered that slavery still existed over 4 years ago now, after watching a documentary on television, I was shocked. I couldn't understand how this issue was still happening today. And I asked everybody in my year group at school, that's over 150 children, do you know that slavery still exists? And not one of them knew. And it was from that moment that I was determined to raise awareness and drive positive action around this issue. Slavery is a dehumanizing practice of our own creation, a barbaric degradation of our common humanity. It isn't just an issue happening in faraway countries or faraway communities either. It is happening right on our doorsteps, and a lot of people are unaware of this. I certainly had no idea that slavery continues to persist, hidden in plain sight. I thought it was abolished back in the 19th century. But we are encountering slavery every day, in the clothes we wear, foods we eat, and potentially even on our high streets. Slavery is closer than we think. But what is slavery today? Actually, slavery is the act of controlling or owning someone, commonly through mental or physical threat or abuse. It is the act of physically or emotionally constraining or restricting someone's freedom of movement, forcing them to work for little or no pay, and treating them as property that has been bought or sold. This applies to any person, anyone, and slavery involves a number of highly exploitative practices, including forced labor, bonded labor, state-imposed forced labor, forced marriage, human trafficking, sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, and organ trafficking, to name a few. And now, human trafficking is one of the main forms of slavery that we see today. And it is when you're transporting, or when somebody is transporting illegally a person or people from one country or one area to another into a form of slavery. And this could be across international borders, state boundaries, or even between houses. And as I mentioned earlier, slavery is happening closer than we think. And in fact, a recent report published by Justice and Care, which is an anti-slavery organisation, confirms that there are over 100,000 victims of modern slavery in the UK. That's 10 times greater than what the government has been previously estimating. And the most common forms of slavery that we see in the UK are forced labour, sexual exploitation, and also with an increased online presence of young people during this COVID-19 crisis, we're seeing an increase in the rates of online or cyber trafficking, as we would call it. And the main question around this issue is why and how? Why is slavery still existing, and how is it that this crime and these forms of exploitation are still existing today? And the answer to that question is because of vulnerabilities. Wherever there are vulnerabilities, traffickers are ready to exploit. Therefore, it can be concluded that there are a number of different challenges and issues that exacerbate the rates of exploitation across the globe. Poverty, gender inequality, lack of access to education, hunger, culture, toxic masculinity, political ideology. These are all challenges that lead to vulnerabilities, which in turn increase the risks of exploitation. And one of the issues which worsens the risk of someone being trafficked into slavery, which I would like to go into more depth about today, is climate change. Now, it is critical to acknowledge that we are living in a world where nearly all of these global issues that we face and all these challenges that we face are interlinked in some form. It is therefore crucial that when we are tackling some of the greatest human rights issues of our time, that an intersectional and all-inclusive approach is taken. As I mentioned earlier, traffickers recruit victims through exploiting vulnerabilities. Across the globe, we are seeing the detrimental impacts of climate change on populations. As global temperatures increase, millions of people are fleeing their homes to avoid the impacts of droughts and extreme storms. And these numbers are set to rise. The International Organization on Migration estimates that up to 200 million people could be displaced by climate change by 2050. The effects on water supplies has gravely worsened the impact of the conflict in Yemen, leading to an estimated 55,000 deaths. In Bangladesh, the World Bank has warned that the number of people displaced by climate change could reach 13.3 million by 2050. There is also increasing evidence to suggest that climate change is helping to fuel the spike in the number of Central American migrants seeking to enter the US. Sea levels are rising at the fastest rate in 3,000 years, at an average of 3 millimeters per year. This has resulted in parts of Jakarta, Indonesia's capital, home to over 10 million people, sinking as much as 25 centimeters per year. The climate crisis is increasing vulnerabilities. It is one of the root causes of poverty, famine, inequalities, and this in turn increases the risk of people being lured by traffickers into slavery. Of the nearly 25 million people worldwide thought to be victims of forced labor, a form of modern slavery today, one of the most common forms of modern slavery today. 56% are in the Asia-Pacific region, 18% in Africa, and 9% in Latin America. Climate change will exacerbate threats in these areas further, especially as migrant flows between rural and urban areas increase. And one of these forms of forced labor is slavery in the supply chains of the fish that we consume. There is a clear link here between overfishing, the environmental decline of fish stocks, and exploitative labor practices as seen on fishing boats, most notably in Thailand's fishing industry. There is a high demand for cheap seafood, which is leading to worsening, abusive, and exploitative conditions for fishing laborers, often children, and often in the form of debt bondage. Debt bondage, or bonded labor, is when victims of slavery are in real terms paying off their debts to their traffickers through labor or through work. It might be paying off the cost of accommodation, transportation, or even food, and unfortunately, as victims are paid so little, this debt can be passed down to future generations, leaving families trapped in a vicious cycle of forced labor. In the agriculture industry, there is also a clear link between climate change and slavery. The vulnerability faced by agrarian communities in the global south because of current and future climate change impact, such as the rise in severity of droughts and flooding, as well as increasing sea levels and temperatures, is a major driving factor behind exploitation. Small farming communities with declining state support and facing increased marketization in agriculture are more vulnerable to exploitative labor practices and human trafficking. In forest areas, due to the destructive nature of the logging industry, we have seen an increase in people subjected to debt-bonded labor and deforestation. Other studies have highlighted the dependency in Brazil and Indonesia on expensive charcoal, cattle, and palm oil industries upon an exploited workforce. This shows that debt bondage labor is entangled with deforestation and the large-scale clearing of the Amazon, Sumatran, and Bornean rainforests. In Peru, over 1/3 of the country's glaciers have melted since the 1970s, causing both floods and water scarcity. This has rendered the lives of rural people highly precarious. Residents of central Peru have experienced significant impacts to their way of life after glacial melting, forcing farms onto the lower levels of the mountains and placing strains on the available farmland. Many Peruvians, particularly young people, have been driven to migrate to city areas to find work, placing them at an increased risk of exploitation and leaving a deficit in the rural workforce. In Bolivia, climate change contributes to the disappearance of the country's second largest lake in 2015. The progressive impact from climate change has been experienced in the area after the lake and other smaller lakes dried up. Traditional farming and fishing practices have therefore ceased, leading to people migrating in search of work. In 2016, Bolivia had one of its largest droughts, which forced people to ration water. This desperation leaves people vulnerable and open to traffickers, luring them into slavery with the false promise of a better life. So ultimately, what we are seeing is that the threats of climate change are opening up a wealth of possibilities and vulnerabilities that traffickers are ready to exploit. And these persistent vulnerabilities, combined with our demand as consumers, explains how this lucrative industry makes over $150 billion in illegal profits every year. However, despite the fact that slavery is an issue hidden in plain sight, that we are encountering every single day, that it is such a deep-rooted issue, there is hope, because we can play a central role in the fight against this crime. When it comes to tackling slavery generally, there are a number of steps that we can take. Educating ourselves is really important. Spreading the word, letting people know that slavery still exists today and closer than we think, is really crucial. In fact, I was recently speaking to a group of MPs, and they didn't even know that slavery still existed today until I reached out to them. And these are the people running our country. So it's really important to let people know that slavery still exists today and that it is an intersectional issue, that it is interconnected with so many other different challenges that we face today. The second thing that we can do as global citizens is write to our local or national government representatives to get them to take action around tackling this issue. Now, this could be developing local strategies to support survivors of slavery, but also on a national level, getting businesses and companies to produce statements that declare what they are doing to tackle slavery in their supply chains, to be transparent, but also to ensure that they're taking action. And it's really important to understand here as well that government legislation is instrumental in building a slave-free world. And that brings me on to my final point, which relates more to that link between modern slavery and climate change, and that is to consume consciously. Nearly every product we encounter could have been produced using slavery. At some point in that product supply chain, a form of forced labor or bonded labor could have occurred. Electronics, garments, and agriculture are the products which are at highest risk of being produced using slave labor. And when it comes to the fashion and agriculture industries, in particular, the ways in which we can change our consumption habits can counter slavery and can help us tackle climate change too. Again, we are seeing this notion of intersectionality arise here. When it comes to agriculture, goods are at risk of being produced using slavery. We know this, and the Gang Masters and Labour Abuse Authority, or the GLAA, estimates that between 10,000 and 13,000 victims of modern slavery in the UK are subjected to forced labour in the agricultural industries. This means that the fruit, vegetables, the fish, meat, cereals, chocolates, the goods that we are producing regularly from our supermarkets could have been produced using slavery. And there are two ways that we can avoid this as consumers. The first is to buy from sustainable or ethical brands, but an alternative way is to buy locally produced food or to even grow your own fruits and vegetables at home, or switch to a diet with less meat and fish consumption. This way you know that there isn't any slave labour being used, and also you are being more sustainable. You're reducing your wastage and your carbon footprint. In terms of the fashion industry, we know that the fast fashion industry is definitely using forced labour in supply chains, whether it be in Uzbekistan, where children are forced to work on farms picking cotton because children have smaller fingers and so it's quicker and easier for them to pick the cotton, or in factories in Bangladesh, India, or even concentration camps in China, where people are being forced to work endless hours cutting and sewing garments. At any point in the supply chain of our clothes, slave labour could be occurring. The International Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labour has confirmed that 1 in 5 garments produced globally were made using forced labour from the Uyghur population that is being held in concentration camps in China. Now, not only are fast fashion brands such as H&M, Primark, Zara, Boohoo, not only are they profiting from the exploitation of people, but they are also negatively impacting our environment. The fast fashion industry accounts for around 20% of industrial water pollution, 35% of ocean microplastic pollution, and it also produces vast quantities of textile waste, which overall emits 1.2 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year. However, again, we can counter the fast fashion industry. Slow fashion needs to become normalized, just as buying secondhand needs to become normalized too. Buying secondhand is a great way to counter the fast fashion industry. But buying secondhand or buying sustainably or ethically isn't an excuse to buy more or buy unnecessarily. We have to slow our consumption, which in turn will slow the demand. So before you buy something new, always ask yourself, do I really need this? And if you can buy from ethical stores, that is great. But ethical clothing is expensive, and so that is why buying secondhand is a great alternative. Again, not only does this have benefits of tackling slavery and human rights abuses, but you're also helping the environment too. And on top of this, it is also great practice to hold brands and companies to account. Ask them who made their products, how much their workers were paid in their supply chains per piece of product produced, and if they were treated fairly. Write to brands, email them, call them, protest. And also, commenting on their social media posts is a great way to put pressure on brands, and it also engages others who are viewing their posts into the conversation too. It's one of my favorite evening activities. Urge brands to not only be transparent about their supply chains, but to actually take action to tackle human rights and environmental abuses. For example, the cocoa industry employs over 2 million children working in their supply chains. They are also deforesting land and harvesting palm oil unsustainably. So write to brands such as Cadbury's or Nestle, or comment on their social media posts and urge them to take action. We as consumers have a lot of underestimated power. If a brand cannot tell you how they are protecting their workers or the environment in their supply chains, how much their workers are paid, or who made their products, take your spending power elsewhere. So really, there are a number of issues that need to be addressed when tackling modern slavery and human trafficking. Ultimately, it all boils down to addressing these vulnerabilities stemming from wider issues such as climate change, inequalities, poverty. It's about providing people with that information, that education, and protection. And as much as a harrowing and shocking topic this is, whenever I speak about it, I like to introduce a lot of hope and compassion into the conversation too, because we can all play a part in tackling slavery and human trafficking. Together, we can ensure that every human being has access to basic human rights. Thank you.